Hello, this is Dr. Rebecca Wood, and I would like to welcome you to our Week 5 lecture. This week we will be focusing on the ideas of science and theology. What is nature? What is the truth? Humanity has tried to figure out the answers to these questions since there were human beings. Titus Lucretius Carus, our first author this week, wrote about On the Nature of Things, talking about how matter was constructed. And he wrote a poem about science, which is pretty interesting since most of the science I've ever read has been in prose, and most of that has been in very long, wordy prose. And he wrote this poem more than 2,000 years ago, before the birth of Christ. And this poem was lost for 1,400 years, so it's hard to say if there were other copies of this or how many other copies of his work existed, but it was written so long ago and then discovered so much later. And Lucretius didn't invent the idea of atoms. The idea was based on Epicurus's philosophical ideas, and also Epicurus would have based his ideas on the work of others. So scientists have always been sharing their work, and then later scientists build on that work. William Paley was a student and then a teaching fellow at Cambridge University. He wrote several books that became standard text at his school even after his death. They include Principles of Moral and Political Philosophy, published in 1786, View of the Evidences of Christianity, published in 1794, and then the work for which we have an excerpt in our book, Natural Theology, published in 1802. And Paley's work influenced Charles Darwin when he was a student at Cambridge during the 1820s. And if you ever have a chance, there's a Darwin passage in our textbook as well. And Paley popularized the theory that God was the designer of the world and that creation was not a random act of nature. And he explained in vivid detail, in an image that people could really catch on to and made it more interesting, how the world could be compared to a watch with intricate mechanisms, proving that there must have existed an artificer or artificers who formed it for a reason. So his idea was that the world was created by a God who was a craftsman, and that's why everything seemed to have a design, and that idea was also known as intelligent design. And then our other author this week was Karl Popper, and he was born much later than our other two authors in 1902 in Vienna, Austria. His family, when he was alive or after he was born, was Lutheran, but they had been Jewish. And he studied at the University of Vienna, where he earned a PhD, but then he left Austria first for England and then New Zealand to avoid the Nazis in Europe. So at the time that he lived in Europe and when he was born, there were some forces in Europe that made it very dangerous for someone to be Jewish or even formally Jewish. And in our passage in the textbook from Karl Popper's work, he begins with a quote from another author, Anthony Trollope, who was a famous British author who wrote in the same vein as Charles Dickens. He used satire and humor to help make his arguments and his writing more interesting and powerful. And as a side note, Anthony Trollope once visited St. Louis during the time of the Civil War. And this is the quote we have from Anthony Trollope's work. Mr. Turnbull had predicted evil consequences and was now doing the best in his power to bring about the verification of his own prophecies. And so since Karl Popper included that quote in his own work, he is emphasizing the idea that scientists who make predictions or have theories do everything in their power to prove that those theories are correct, even if it really means that they are falsifying evidence to get that theory to work. And so Popper's view of science was that its theories must not only prove to be true, but also prove that they are not false. And he went on to mention some ways that they could be tested, as in Einstein's theory of relativity, and proven not to be wrong in a new application of that theory. And then here's an example, of when science, theology, and progress all kind of collided. So there have been times when science and theology have come into conflict. One major example of this is in Galileo's life, and Galileo did not totally come up with the idea that the earth rotates around the sun, but he popularized it, and he was a very popular teacher and was very exciting, except that he was also arrogant and made enemies, and also his theory led to conflicts with the Catholic Church. And eventually he was convicted of heresy and spent his remaining years under house arrest. So his ideas and his writings brought him into such conflict with the church that he ended up imprisoned at his own house. And then science, medicine, and theology have had some other conflicts. We won't go into all of them in detail, but there have been countless scientific and medical discoveries, and some of them, like astronomy for Galileo, came into conflict with theology. Microbiology, there were many people that did not believe in the germ theory of disease and thought that that was made up. And there were doctors and medical professionals who refused to wash their hands because they thought that was kind of a heretical idea in the field of medicine. Automobiles, there are still some religions on our planet today that restrict use of automobiles for certain reasons for certain people. Blood transfusions and newer ideas such as stem cell therapy. And then there's a major issue with science and theology and morality. For just about my whole life, we've had to be concerned about nuclear power or nuclear bombs. And so the knowledge of atomic particles increased exponentially between Lucretius and more recent scientists such as Marie Curie, Albert Einstein, and Richard Feynman. And so it's up to all of us on the planet to think about what happens next. What is the future of science? What is the future of our belief system and literally the world? And of course, since I had sources in this presentation, I have a works cited page here, as we are all working on those for our research. And so anything that is quoted just from our editorial material in the book is quoted from the editor of the book, Michael Austin, and then I use something from each one of our authors this week, and so they're listed on the works cited page. And then I also used some information from the Galileo biography on biography.com, so I documented that as well. So I hope everyone has a great week, and I'm looking forward to reading your papers and your comments on the discussion board. Thank you very much.